apologise. Every journal is different. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of journals, all with slightly different guides to authors. That's because the editor-in-chief normally discusses with the publisher what should be in the guide to authors. And we, as publishers, try to accommodate the editor-in-chief to say, okay, you want these things in to help you to review the paper or to attract the right papers, the right topics. Certainly, we'll put that in the guide to authors. That's why they're always a bit different. And so, when you are going to be writing your manuscript as a draft, read the guide to authors first, and then write it using that as a guideline, because that's far easier than to write it and then adapt it to the journal you've chosen later. And it's easier to, again, get it through the first level of the peer review, because the last thing the editor wants to get is a paper formatted for a rival journal. He says, well, why have I got this? It's formatted for the other journal. And since I recognise the style, it must have been rejected. They just sent it on to me. So they don't respect that. So it's worthwhile spending the time just getting the right layout, the right guide for authors information used when you're writing. So what steps do you need to do before writing your paper? Do you have everything you need? What sort of paper will it be? What sort of journal will it be? And the guide to authors. Now, I haven't got the definitive answer here. There's two answers. When do you start writing? One person would say, you get everything in, analyze it, and you start writing. Someone else will say, all the results in, you start writing some bits whilst you're analysing, because writing about it helps you analyse. It doesn't really matter, as long as you're very clear in your own mind what you're doing. But the important thing is that the sequence of writing each section is important. You might read a paper from top to bottom, but that's not how you write it. I'll get much more into the layout and structure after the break. Length of paper, it depends. Some journals are very, very specific. They say you could only do a certain number of illustrations or a certain number of words or whatever. But typically, a full-length paper, that's a guideline for you. Again, it'll be in the PDF handed out later. But typically, abstract, around 250 words, introduction, 1 or 2 pages, methods, 2 to 4 pages, results, discussion, conclusions, figures, tables, references. Some journals, for example, BBRC, says 3,000 words, full stop, no more. So you've got to be very clear, and if it's 3,100, it'll be rejected. So it's worthwhile reading the guide for authors, the journal you've chosen. Now, language is important because, of course, you have a set of thoughts in your head, and you're probably thinking in multiple languages, as we all do. Then you try and formulate the words on paper and then send it through to someone. As I said, the essence of your research has got to be somehow been shrunk down to those 10 or 12 pages. And the editor and reviewers have to know very clearly what you're doing. They don't want to guess. If they guess, they'll probably guess wrongly. For English first language people, their problem is they write too much. They write lots of material, it's all a long story, and it's almost like creative writing. So they actually have to cut down their text, and that's difficult for those people. English second or third language have the difficulty in getting the right clarity of language without too many small, simple errors. So here's what an editor said. If there's more than 6 grammatical errors in the abstract alone, I don't even bother to send it out for review. I reject it. You might think it's harsh, but that's their viewpoint. So therefore, you've really got to make it seem like it's good enough to be published as is in the quality of the English. Now, scientific language, as I say, is not creative writing. If you went into science as a researcher to avoid writing, I'm sorry. Your job as a scientist is to communicate either by talks, posters, or papers your research. This communication is normally in writing. So you have to almost develop the love of scientific writing so you can really communicate your research ideas well to people. So you've got to think about simple things, sentence construction, tenses, bad grammar, and also if you are trilingual, you might have a word or two in there which is not English. You don't spot it. That's fine because you read all 3 languages. But what happens if you happen to be reading this paper in South Korea and you read South Korean, Japanese and English, and you don't read Arabic or French? So you've got to be very careful to make sure that it's also very clear to everyone, because currently English is the language for research communication in the world. Here's a few tips, again they'll be on the PDF afterwards. Correct short sentences. One idea per sentence. Because this is how you shouldn't do it. This is one sentence, which should be perhaps 8 sentences. Just simple, one sentence, one idea. Because your good science must not suffer because of poor English. If you do have someone, a colleague or someone you can ask who is good at English, fluent in English, English first language or pretty good at English, ask them to help. And also, you might read English a lot. You might listen to English. How often do you talk in English between each other? How often do you write in English? Consider perhaps keeping your lab records in English, or even 2 sets of lab records, one in French and one in English. Perhaps consider emailing in English. This increases your fluency, making it easier. Now, I know that French is the main language here in terms of higher education. I'm doing a workshop in Lyon, in France, later in the year, and on purpose they say it has to be in English, because I said, should it be English? If it's French, someone else will do it. It has to be in English because 50% of our research institute do not speak French. This is the middle of France, Lyon. Because science is international. People move around between different institutes, different countries. And English is the language they use to communicate. So the more you get used to talking, speaking, emailing, and so on, it's interesting, but and it's a challenge, I understand. We had that problem recently in our office in Beijing. We have 35 people there, all Chinese, and a few people were English. And some of those people left or moved or went back home. And as there's currently no one in our Beijing office who doesn't speak Chinese, everyone now speaks Chinese to each other. And I've noticed in telephone calls with my colleagues there, the quality of their spoken English has gone down in the last 6 months because they're not using it anymore in conversation. It's very interesting. And if you want to become well recognised worldwide to do presentations or international symposia, you've got to be comfortable in presenting in English, and therefore you've got to practice it. Do we correct language? We do to a degree, of course. We have certain websites which have low-cost language polishing, certain high-quality science articles we will do some polishing for. We have a technical pre-screening which cuts out the bad English to stop it getting to the editors, and that typically will take out 10% of all submissions. Don't get to the editor even. They're rejected by a company in India who checks language first. It's the author's responsibility. You know the science. You know the language. If someone changes the language to polish it, they might change the science and do your work a disservice. So again, it's your responsibility. Because copy editing does not make up for poor writing. So again, just an overview. Write with clarity, objectivity, accuracy, and brevity. If you can say it in 5 words, don't use 8 or 10, use 5. Make sure the sentence construction is there, incorrect tenses are not right, corrected, grammar, languages, and so on, spelling mistakes, typos. Make sure you also use one language. Use American English or British English. If you're submitting to a international journal, you typically can use either one, but not mixed. So make sure your spell checker is set for British English or American English. If you submit to an American Society journal, they normally insist on American spelling. If they see British spelling, they'll reject your paper, just because you chose the wrong spell checker. Simple things. Just worthwhile thinking of these things. And again, the Guide to Authors does talk about language requirements. So here's a few. I know we're running a bit short of time, aren't we? But are we okay?
We can take like 15 minutes from the break.
Okay.
So
You mean these poor people have to have a 15-minute break rather than half an hour?
we can bring our coffee back.
Fine, wonderful. So languages, again, long sentences confuse readers who are English second language, third language, most of them. This seems strange, but someone has counted this. The average length of a sentence in a scientific article worldwide of tens of thousands of sentences and articles is 12 to 17 words. I don't know if that's good news or bad news, but I share that with you. I talked about the elements, one element of the sentence earlier. Again, not large amounts of text. Try not to have things like however, in addition, moreover, several conjunctives. It just pads, doesn't help. You want the clarity of message for another scientist in another country. And this also, it's already been found that, no, just clarity. And if you're going to use things like needless to say, don't say it. Just leave it. Be as clean and simple and clear as you can. In your languages, the tense is important. For facts and hypotheses, it's the present tense. So here you see an example. The average life of a honeybee is 6 weeks. It's past tense for experiments, so honeybees were maintained. And a past tense when you describe results, with the average life was. So tense is present tense, past tense, and past tense. Often it goes wrong. And you can use the passive voice, it has been found, or we found. If you want to make a shorter sentence, you use we found. Although with American society journals, they prefer the passive voice. They prefer to say, it has been found, not we found. It's just a a strange thing about American society journals. And again, passive voice or the active voice. It depends on how you do your grammar. I know that you probably didn't focus too much on English grammar when you were a scientist in your studies. I'm trying to help by being simple, but yeah, it's second nature for someone who's English first language. So again, as you're learning to write, find someone who can help you, someone who's reasonable in English, either an expatriate who is English, who lives here, or someone who's just passing through, who's good at English or whatever. Just help. And again, if you're not sure of certain words, then change the word to something else. So again, clarity. If a word can be ambiguous, change that word to meaning one simple word. That's the thing the British do very badly. They write their manuscripts using what the Dutch would call expensive words, very highly educated words, which most of the world don't understand. It's unclear. You've got to be clear to the world. The researcher, the second language researcher out there in the world who wants to hear your message, and you want them to hear it. Here's a few examples of people saying, editor saying, this. It's all inside, references therein. Of course the references are therein, that's why you cited them. And in the present report, don't say that, just say here or below or something. Again, you don't need to pad explaining, hereunder you will find the references to the previous work. No, that's nonsense. So sometimes you've got difficult things. How the data is stored, data are stored, that also tends to be a language difference. Pharmacokinetics of paracetamol is, there's exceptions, but typically the third singular form of verbs. This is often what people do wrongly because of emails or SMS or whatever, text messages. They use it's and weren't and hasn't and don't in writing. That's spoken only. When you're writing it, you do it is, has not, do not, does not, whatever. You do not do this. This actually shows that you are not particularly clear in writing English. Now the difficulty for an editor is if they see lots of bad English mistakes throughout your paper, they think, if the paper has these English mistakes, does it have any science mistakes too? That's not fair. That, I'm afraid, is how you get judged. So it's worthwhile thinking that if I can correct all of the spelling mistakes, tense mistakes, everything else, it's easier for the editor and the reviewers to value and judge my science. Again, I talked earlier about mixed languages. Not just in the text, also in the figures. You might forget you've got some little, it happens to be Japanese, some little, no, sorry, Chinese. You happen to have some text in the figure there because you're so used to reading it